that Ukraine's advance into Kursk shows the mettle of the Ukrainians. From 13 days now, Russia, nuclear-armed Russia, has a foreign army on its soil and with no major response.
Before we continue, we invite you to follow our channel, the only American show reporting live from Ukraine every day.
We go live to Ukraine right now. Check in with Joseph Lindsley. Good afternoon in Ukraine to you, Joseph.
Wendy, good afternoon from Kyiv. The weather has returned to scorching levels, about 90 degrees today, and we've had, most people have had electricity the past weeks, but it's expected that there will be cuts throughout the country due to the weather. And meanwhile, 33 years ago from yesterday, August 19th, 1991, there was a lot happening in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to reform the communist regime in Moscow. And there was a committee formed called the State Committee on the State of Emergency of the Communist Party. And they were very concerned about these reforms. And I think many American observers at the time, including the CIA, thought that there was no way that the USSR was going to collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev was stranded at his dacha in his summer house in the Crimean Peninsula, which is part of Ukraine. It still is, but it's occupied by Russia now. And so the Communist Party was getting its grip back on things and trying to stop the reforms and the movement for change that was happening throughout the Soviet Union, especially throughout Eastern Bloc countries like Ukraine, like the Baltic states. And within 3 days of August 19th, 1991, of this secret, this emergency committee forming and restricting the people's freedoms even more, within 3 days, this attempt to get rid of Gorbachev had failed. And within 5 days, Ukraine declared independence on August 24th, 1991. And so 33 years ago, it was a momentous week here. And it's a reminder that, for some time, especially between 2014 and 2022, Ukrainians thought they really had obtained for good their freedom from Moscow. And we see that despite all that, it's still an ongoing battle, and it really hasn't changed. The nature of the Kremlin really has not changed from the Soviet times.
That is fascinating, Joseph. DNC, of course, here in Chicago, and there were some remarks about Ukraine from last night's Democratic National Convention. Tell us about that.
Indeed, President Biden, it was a big speech for him. Really, it was his passing the baton on to Vice President Harris. And so he wanted to be triumphant, it seemed, of course, to acknowledge the things that he's achieved. And he mentioned Ukraine only once, which might be interesting. This is the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. But he spoke, rather triumphantly, and he said that among the accomplishments were that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, and there was, wild applause in the hall. But I think, from the perspective and sharing that clip with people in Ukraine today, it was a bit heavy for people to hear, because the only reason Finland and Sweden joined NATO, Sweden had been neutral since the 18th century, is because they were terrified of Russia. It wasn't really a moment of triumph. And President Biden said that 10 days, when he was talking about Ukraine, he said 10 days before Henry Kissinger died, the former Secretary of State, who I used to know and used to go to baseball games with in New York, Kissinger called Biden and said, not since Napoleon since the days of Napoleon, Europe has looked at Russia with dread. And then President Biden said, but not now. Guess what? Putin thought he'd take Kyiv in 3 days, and 3 years later, Ukraine is still free. And the crowd went wild, which is an indication that, among the Democrats, there's widespread support and appreciation for Ukraine on the positive side. But on the negative side, when I showed Ukrainians that clip, it was very hard for them to see, because the crowd is going wild as though this has been won. And the fact is that Europe is terrified of Russia. That's why, the countries have been buying more weapons than they have since the Cold War in case they get invaded. And so the triumphant tone seemed a bit at odds with, actually very much at odds with the situation here. And Politico had this scoop a few days ago. There was a letter from former American generals and ambassadors of both parties Republicans and Democrats. Top, General Philip Breedlove, who was Supreme Allied Commander, top NATO generals, former ambassadors to Ukraine and to Russia. And it was a very polite letter to President Biden, and they acknowledged the good that he's done. But they said there's still a major problem, and they were imploring him to use his remaining time in office, now that he doesn't have to personally worry about political calculations, to address this. They said as long as Ukraine cannot fire back at Russian missile launch points, Ukraine will be forever vulnerable, and Ukraine will continue to bleed out. And that's the very reason why when Ukrainians saw, that raucous applause in Chicago at the DNC, Ukraine is, there's good news in Kursk. Ukrainians are still, they're advancing at a bit of a slower rate than it has been the past few days, but they're holding their ground. But meanwhile, in the east, in Donbass, the fighting is absolutely brutal. Cities, especially near the front line, are being hit by missiles all the time. And so this bipartisan group of retired generals and ambassadors said in this very polite letter, but very firm, they said, we applaud your administration for removing some limitations on Ukraine's usage of U.S. weapons, but all restrictions must be lifted. Victory means taking out the archer, not defending indefinitely against his arrows. And so the idea is that, the United States right now will give Ukraine a capacity, air defense to protect when Russian missiles hit this country. But as long as they're not able to hit the source of those missiles, there's no way that this can end in a good way. And in fact, they very strongly in this letter said that that the White House has given Russia a sanctuary in which it can operate its war machine with impunity. And so there's a hope that maybe in the remaining months of the Biden administration, that the administration can find a new freedom to really push for victory, and that Ukraine's advance into Kursk shows the mettle of the Ukrainians. From 13 days now, nuclear-armed Russia, has a foreign army on its soil and with no major response. And so there's a hope that this can give some additional courage to those in Washington.
Well, I sure hope so, and that's really interesting. I really appreciate your report today, and we will check in with you tomorrow. Joseph, stay safe, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important, that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Що він сказав?
Well, which side are you on? На чиїй ти стороні? Come on now. Oh, which side are you on? На чиїй ти стороні?